You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Last week, in episode 431, we explored the life and influence of Thomas Paine and how his pamphlet Common Sense shaped revolutionary thought in 1776. But Thomas Paine didn't work in a vacuum. His arguments reached a population that was already primed by years of storytelling, stories that told British Americans who they were, what they stood for, and why they should resist British rule altogether. So in today's episode, we're going to revisit episode 144 with historian Robert Parkinson, author of the award-winning book, The Common Cause, Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution. Rob takes us inside the broader messaging strategy of the revolution, a strategy that revolutionary leaders used to forge a sense of unity across the 13 disparate colonies. This episode, which originally aired in 2017, remains one of our most thought-provoking explorations of how the rhetoric of the revolution was crafted and at what cost. Now, during our exploration, Rob reveals what the Common Cause was and how revolutionary leaders used it to unite colonists, the critical role of newspapers in shaping revolutionary messaging, and how appeals to race, fear, and exclusion help forge an American identity. But before we revisit this fascinating conversation, I have some exciting news to share. The doors to the History Explorers Club are now open, and this week, we're celebrating with grand opening pricing and bonuses. The History Explorers Club is a community built by historians for people just like you, people who love history. It's where curious minds explore the past together. Inside the club, you'll get live events, not just more content. At least 2 live conversations each month with guest historians where you can ask them your very own questions. Plus 3 live calls with me, our monthly town hall call, plus 2 informal lunchtime calls where we can walk through and talk through whatever history ideas or questions you're exploring. Plus, each quarter, we also host a hands-on workshop with a historian on how they uncover the past. And this quarter, in February, Zara Innes Hanslin will show us how she reads material objects for historical evidence. Plus, you'll also get access to our community space where you can ask questions, meet fellow explorers, and learn together. And if you join this week, you'll also get a special onboarding call with me on January 24th, plus the first access to 3 curated reading lists for the colonial, revolutionary, and early republic periods that I created because you've been asking for them. So join us at historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. I can't wait to see you there. All right, are you ready to explore the messaging of the American Revolution? Allow me to reintroduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is an assistant professor of history at Binghamton University. He's the author of 8 articles and book chapters about the American Revolution and issues of race and nation-making in the early modern world. And he's the author of the award-winning book, The Common Cause, Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Robert Parkinson.
Thank you, Liz. Great to be here.
And it's really great to have you here, Rob, because so many people are talking about your book. I mean, I know guests have brought it up in at least 2 of the 4 teaser episodes for the new Doing History to the Revolution series. So we're really anxious to speak with you about your book and find out more about it.
Well, thank you. It's an honor for people to be talking about it.
Well, why don't we start with the idea of the Common Cause? Would you tell us what it was and provide us with a brief overview of why it was necessary for the revolution?
So the Common Cause is an argument or an appeal made by patriot leaders as to why they thought that colonists all over North America should support their rebellion. So what I think of as the Common Cause appeal really is in 2 different phases. And in the book, I talk about this being kind of the conflict between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War, because those 2 things are not exactly the same thing. And there's 2 sort of phases of the Common Cause appeal. One, it evolves over this imperial crisis, what I call the American Revolution from 1764 to 1774. And that notion of the appeal is very positive. It's putting forward an idea of a heroic masculine resistance to tyranny, rejecting luxury and defeat consumption, taking action and not being passive in defense of your rights, of participating in government, in consent and representation, all those kind of things. And I think that the zenith, the high point of that movement, that argument, is the Continental Association that's passed in the fall of 1774 that has all those ideas packed into it, right? This idea that Americans should make their own clothing and reject gambling and going to the theater. And we are all in this together, and we are all sort of one band of brothers. And anybody who's not on our team needs to be observed and their activities inspected and perhaps called out to be an enemy of their country. It's this first real notion of who we are. And that even includes the stopping of the Atlantic slave trade is part of the Continental Association. So all this ideas of this very positive, what we could call the Jedi side, the light side of the common cause, sort of encapsulates in 1774, and then the shooting starts. And things start to change at that point. And things get very messy because wars are messy. And so when the American Revolution becomes something else, it becomes the Revolutionary War, the common cause appeal evolves too. And what I found in my research was that the common cause appeal started to develop a second, darker valence to it. Because now the pressure of unity is really on. Now that blood is being shed, and these notions of potential tyranny, anticipated coercion is now not just a Massachusetts or a New England problem, but it could happen anywhere. And now that is moving to actual energy. Well, the pressure on unity is there on it, and there are all kinds of fault lines that are undermining that sense of unity, all kinds of ones dividing the colonies. Tensions between sort of Atlantic settlements and frontier or upcountry settlements, and whether or not these guys want to be on the same side, or there are some sort of secession movements between East and West. Religion is a dividing factor that it has a problem all over the place. There are border disputes all over the mid-Atlantic and New England especially, slavery, economic rivalries. There's a lot of things that are potentially driving the colonies apart. So when this evolution happens, they need to find some sort of ground that will hold these 13 colonies together, because it's their only chance of defeating the British military state is if they stay together. Once the shooting does start, boy, this common cause appeal shifts from this something we would prefer it to be in, where you can have the capacity to abolish the Atlantic slave trade, and you have this idea about sort of this positive defense of rights, and now it becomes something very different. It comes into this sort of darker thing. And in many ways, that's about manipulating people's prejudices about what we will later call race. And that's where this darker valence comes in.
So the Common Cause was this story that transformed the revolution from a rebellion into a unifying patriotic event. A story that was at first positive and then took a darker turn as the revolution turned into a war. But when precisely did this story of American unity begin, and who started it?
Well, it starts almost right away. I mean, in the dissertation of which this book is based a long, long time ago, I spent somewhere along 75% of the time focused on the year and a half between the shooting started and the Declaration of Independence. Because when I started researching, I started reading newspapers, and I was blown away by the amount of material that I was finding in these newspapers about British agents inciting African-American resistance on slave plantations in using verbs like tampering with or whispering to native peoples all across sort of the backcountry. And that starts almost immediately. And I have a very long chapter on 1775 because as soon as May comes, the news of Lexington and Concord reaches South Carolina by the first few days of May. And then the next week is when the Second Continental Congress is going to sit in Philadelphia, and they make these decisions about who's going to be in charge of this force that's gathering in Boston. And we have this traditional story about 1775 that starts with Lexington and Concord and goes through Bunker Hill and Washington taking control of the Continental Army. And then there's sort of the invasion of Quebec in Canada. And a modified version of that account would also feature Dunmore's proclamation on what's going on in Virginia. But those are not all the stories that I found when I read the newspapers closely. And when I read them, even starting in May, they are focused not on the camp at Cambridge. These newspaper reports that are published all throughout the colonies, they're focused on what should New Yorkers do about Indian Superintendent Guy Johnson? Should they take him prisoner? And if they do, what response will that provoke from the Six Nations? And there's all the kinds of weird sort of ghostly figures in June and July of 1775 about finding a dead body in a field in Butternuts, New York. And what does that mean? Does that mean that Indians are now taking up the hatchet on the King's defense? Some people run into St. Luke Lacorne, who's the very, very famous Indian agent who is deemed to be responsible for the massacre at Fort William Henry. And he's going around with a group of Caughnawaga Indians, and people are whispering about, what does this mean? And we know who this guy is. And is George using him to try to incite Indians to kill us? This is what people are talking about all through the summer. And they're also talking about not just Dunmore in Virginia as the Virginia governor, but Josiah Martin is the governor of North Carolina, and he's accused of perhaps inciting slave revolts. And William Campbell is the governor of South Carolina, and he's also accused of inciting slave revolts. And so there's this much larger context for what's going on here. And this is beginning in the summer and fall of 1775. Now, I will say the reason that this is news is because a lot of these guys are actually doing this. Martin is considering this. Campbell tries to keep some of his thought process about what will happen with African Americans quiet in South Carolina. And the Indian superintendent for the southern colonies, John Stewart, is accused of sending gunpowder to the Cherokees and talking to the Creeks. But they are doing these things because why wouldn't they? I mean, when I think about this, if whoever could end this rebellion on the cheap, because as we probably know, Britain doesn't have a whole lot of money, thus the taxes, and they're up to their eyeballs in debt. Whoever could end this thing on the cheap and stop this rebellion would be a hero. There'd be statues raised to this person, and their career would just explode in fame and fortune if they were able to end this American rebellion and not have to raise an army and go do whatever it is they're going to have to do. And so they're looking to pull any thread that may be successful. So yes, the Americans are also doing this too. They're sending agents into Canada to talk to Indians and feel them out, whether or not they could also support the American side. So there's a lot of actual talk here, but that's almost immediately being turned into stories about what then this might do to help galvanize support for our side. This is the beginning of this idea of turning this into an opportunity. And that's really the beginning of good things, I think, that keeps the colonies together in 1775 and 76.
Was there a particular person or government body that was in charge of writing the story of the Common Cause? And was authoring this story even something that was a conscious endeavor?
I don't think so. I mean, you have people who are very much attuned to how this looks, right? In many ways, sort of shaping public opinion. Sam Adams is always very interested in shaping public opinion. John Adams, always very interested in shaping public opinion. So one of my very favorite stories is the evening that they are drafting and putting together the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which is on the 6th of July of 1775, an old German veteran appears at the door of the Continental Congress dressed in his full uniform complement from the old country, right? He has this big tall hat and he's dressed in his long sword and he's this incredibly martial appearance and he's just sort of showing the Continental Congress his loyalty. And Adams writes this big, long description of this guy and goes through meticulous detail about what he looked like and the martial sort of ardor that he gave off. And he writes this letter to two of his correspondents. And he says, make sure this gets in the newspaper, but please keep my name out of it. And he says the reason it needs to be in the newspaper is because there are a lot of German Americans and we need to show them this kind of example to impress upon their emotions that this is what they should do too. And sure enough, I think it's James Warren that turns over this letter, but only a piece of this letter from Adams. And it's all anonymous. It's written by a gentleman from Philadelphia, wink, wink. And it appears not just in Boston, but it appears in New England papers and the Mid-Atlantic papers. And that's exactly what Adams wanted to happen, to get that message out there. Both the Adams cousins had their eye to this. And Franklin is the other one. Franklin, who, as we know on Ben Franklin's World, is very much obsessed with appearances and reputation, but also about using things like the press to get to establish narratives. And so Franklin, who was very late in the game as sort of joining the Patriot cause, one of the very last ones through the door in the Patriot leadership, and gives up the ghost of the British Empire almost last. Once he does, with the passion of the recently converted, Franklin is one of my very favorite people who is constantly writing letters about how aghast he is at what the British are doing and how dare they treat us this way. And he brings up this specter of British instigated insurrections and potential massacres all the time. Franklin is very heavily involved in this. And not just Franklin, a number of these sort of high-level Patriot leaders. There's not a conspiracy that I can tell. There's not people sitting around going, hey, we should definitely spread this story, but not that story. But it's not an accident either. This is not something that just happens. News has to be carried from the State House down the street to Dunlap's printing house or to Bradford's house. They are being very explicit about make sure that you put in this paragraph, but not that paragraph. There is a lot of time and money put into thinking about what it is the public knows about the revolution, neither of which are something that are very commodities in plenty that the Continental Congress has, time or money. So if the fact that they are thinking about this and spending a lot of those two things on these particular stories and images suggests that they thought this would play and this would resonate with the American public.
It seems like we should talk about newspapers and even newspapermen, because it sounds like what you're saying is that newspapers served as a primary conveyance for spreading the story of the common cause, and therefore that it was really newspapers and printers who were responsible for uniting the colonists behind the revolution. So I'm curious if you would tell us about newspaper publication during the revolutionary period and about the role that printers may have played in shaping the stories that Franklin and the Adamses sent to them about the common cause.
So when the shooting starts, there are roughly 36 newspapers. The center of gravity is New England, of course. So not just Boston, but the New England colonies have most of the printing, but there's a considerable number of the 36 in Philadelphia and New York. They're all weeklies at this point. The Pennsylvania Evening Post puts out a smaller paper 3 days a week, but that's the only one that does it. And these are 4-page affairs. It's actually one sheet of paper folded down the middle and then printed on the outside and on the inside. And how this works on a weekly paper is they print the outside of the page first. And so what will be the front page of the folded page, where you usually don't find news on the front page, unlike how we would think about a newspaper today. On the front page, usually, and there are no real rules for this, but professionally, this is usually how it works, is they put stuff on the front page that's not fresh because they're going to have to print that first. This is about actually ink drying. So they put on the front page an essay, an older piece of news from London, maybe, that's several weeks old, a magazine, periodical essay. Sometimes there are either literary or political things that are becoming more and more political over the 1760s and 70s. On the back side, the opposite on that outside page is where they put advertisements. Then they hang these sheets up to dry all throughout the print shop. And over the next few days, let's say that happens in the first 3 days of the week, they get the outside of this printed. And then while they're doing that, they then gather what's going to go on the inside. And the inside is the news. And they have 6 columns of news to fill. Well, where do they get that news? There aren't any reporters. There aren't any journalists at all. So they're dependent on a couple of different things. One is somebody giving them news. So this is where gentlemen come in. Hopefully, some very nice gentleman will come down and bring his letters and say, all right, you have my permission to publish this part of my private letter, and usually that's going to be anonymous. Great, that's part of the news. So that might fill up a column or two. Or there's news of ships coming in or ship captains, intelligence, and this is where the fresh news that would come under the byline of the town it's in. So this is a Philadelphia newspaper. You'd find that under Philadelphia. Where does the rest of the news come from? It comes from other newspapers. And so newspapers travel to other printers in America free of charge. And this is a professional courtesy. So they send them to each other. And this is the lifeblood of the newspaper business, is the exchanges. And so if you're in Philadelphia, hopefully the ship will also bring a hopefully not too old copy of a Virginia Gazette or a South Carolina Gazette or a Boston Gazette. And then you would scan that and say, oh, I like this and I like that. And then you would take those things under a Boston or a Williamsburg byline and you put those on the inside of your paper, and the paper's complete and you send it off and you do the whole thing again next week. So those exchanges are really important. And this is how people find out what's going on in other parts of the world. London is the main source of news throughout most of the 18th century. But one of the things that I found is that London news starts to get crowded out during that same summer of 1775. As the Revolutionary War begins to ramp up, more news coming from other American colonies begins to find more and more space on the inside of those newspapers. And so Americans in Philadelphia are learning much more about places they don't know a whole lot about, South Carolina, and what that governor's doing. I have a graph in the end of my book about how the news becomes more and more American as the Revolutionary War gets into its first couple of seasons. And this is in many ways surprising to some people. I mean, Thomas Paine is the editor of a magazine in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Magazine. At the end of the year, he publishes this big, intricate map of all of the rivers and creeks and islands of the Chesapeake area in Virginia and Maryland, because he knows that there's been all this news about Dunmore and Dunmore's proclamation, which features, slaves getting on a boat on this creek and trying to find the governor. And so he knows that his readers can't picture where all this news is happening. So he publishes this very intricate map of those rivers and creeks to match the news that they're finding more and more about.
Just how widespread was the readership of newspapers in early America? I ask because I happen to know from my own research that Albany, New York did not have a regular newspaper until the mid to late 1780s. So how did people who lived outside of, say, Philadelphia, Charleston, or all the other coastal cities become aware of the Common Cause stories that would have been conveyed in these roughly 36 newspapers?
That's a great question. And this is something that I've thought about for a long time. And luckily, one subscription book has survived from this exact time. William Bradford, who's one of the probably two or three most important patriot printers. Eads and Gill in Boston are the most important as far as how supportive they are of the revolution. And they're also, Eads is in the Sons of Liberty, and he might have been on Griffin's Wharf in the Tea Party. They're very much involved in the Boston patriot leadership. John Holt, printer of the New York Journal, is a very important patriot printer in New York. But William Bradford, he and John Dunlap are the two really important patriot printers. And so luckily at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Bradford's subscription books, which are very detailed and run to more than 100 pages, have survived from 1760s to about 1778. And I work on this in the first chapter of the book, and it took me almost 10 years off and on to reconstruct the delivery routes and where these newspapers are going. So the Bradfords are publishing about 1,800 newspapers a week. 400 or 500 are staying in the city. Another 1,300, 1,400 are going out. Well, where are they going out to? The subscription book tells us exactly where they're going. They are headed all over the Pennsylvania countryside. There are long delivery route descriptions of where to drop off bundles of newspapers at this person's house and the tavern there on the Lancaster Road. They're going on ships, and they're going up the Delaware River and into sort of the real Pennsylvania hinterland close to the New York border. They're going all through central New Jersey. There are probably, I can't remember the number of papers that are going into Chesapeake Bay, but it's a surprising amount. There are deliverers of the Pennsylvania Journal going down the eastern shore of Maryland and into Virginia. There are ones going over to Western Maryland and Winchester, Virginia. And this is on top of the ones that are also then going to other printers. Bradford and his son are sending newspapers to the West Indies. There's an entry for Portugal, and there are entries for Albany, and there are ones going to the Continental Camp and to Boston in 1775. So actually, it's a wider web than we might have assumed, and that's just one of the 36 webs. So you have 75 papers of the Pennsylvania Journal going into central New Jersey, but there's also the Pennsylvania Packet and the Pennsylvania Evening Post and the New York Gazette and the New York Journal and the New York Constitutional Gazette. And so where are those going? Now, if we had these subscription books for all 36 places, we might be able to accurately cast these webs in much thicker ways and be able to see this kind of print coverage and this saturation that's happening. And this is only the people that are actually writing to the printer to subscribe to the newspaper. This isn't people who are reading it secondhand or hearing it read out loud in some of those taverns on the Lancaster Road. So I think the coverage of this is more extensive. It's not what it's going to be in the 19th century, but it's certainly an integral part of how the revolution develops.
Thank you for being a Ben Franklin's World listener. Making this podcast is a real joy for me. It's also something that takes real time and care, and the work begins long before you ever press play. Each episode involves research and reading, preparation for our guests, editing, and the work of turning well-researched history into a conversation that's clear, engaging, and grounded in evidence. It also means making space for the questions that so many of us come here for. The daily lives of ordinary people in early America. What they ate, how they worked, worshipped, built communities, served on juries or voted, and how they made the choices they did within the limits and possibilities of their world. It also means building resources for you to come back to, like show notes and transcripts, so you can revisit each episode, follow a thread, or share an episode with others who might be interested. So if Ben Franklin's World has helped you see early American history in a new way, maybe by challenging a familiar story or introducing you to voices that you hadn't heard of before, I hope you'll consider supporting the show with a donation. You can donate just one time, or you can become one of our generous ongoing supporters who donate annually or monthly. You can become a donor at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Thank you. Your support helps keep Ben Franklin's World independent, accessible, and on the air. So thank you so much for your support and for your generosity. Now, earlier you mentioned that the story of the common cause took a dark turn in order to keep Americans united in their fight for independence. So why and how does the story of the common cause take a dark turn?
There are a lot of jealousies. There are a lot of rivalries here. But what is one of the things they have in common? It is notions of prejudice. In some ways, this is also defining people by things that they're not as much as they are about things that they are. And so we are also seeing sort of how some of these stories, to use a word that's certainly being overused in today's world, how you weaponize colonial prejudice as a reason to take up arms. This is something that people can agree on. It's not choosing sides in a religious dispute. That's not something that dissenting Protestants will disagree with. By talking about British inciting slave violence, you're not taking a stand on whether or not slavery is a moral problem or not, and you're not offending slave owners with that. We can all agree that our families and our households need protected from this kind of violence, and that there are clearly identifiable villains in this story. And I think the opportunity that kind of presents itself in 1775 and 1776 is a golden one, but it's one with dark and deep consequences, because I think what the Americans are doing in many ways is define themselves by, well, that's not who we are. I asked my class this, and as a fellow Red Sox fan, Liz, you hopefully will appreciate this. I asked my class, how many people in here hate the Yankees? Now, since I'm now teaching in upstate New York, this has become a very different exercise. But I used to say this was much more effectiveness of, okay, who hates the Yankees? And a bunch of hands would go up, right? And then I'd say, all right, leave your hands up. And then I'd say, okay, now, who do you like? And then all of a sudden things would start to break down. I like the Mets. I like the Cardinals. I like the Cubs. Oh, okay. I like the Braves. Now we have all these points of disagreement. But what almost everybody's hands goes up when we hate the Yankees. And this is the experience, the British, sort of how they coalesce around how they create an identity really out of whole cloth in the early 18th century. Instead of figuring out who we are, they figure out, well, the easiest way and probably the best way to do this is to say, well, we're not the French, and we're not Catholic, and we're not the Stuarts, and we don't like absolutism. Those are all the things we disagree with. And after we do that, then the project of trying to figure out, well, who are we and what are we for is somewhat easier after you've eliminated all the other possibilities. And if you look at sort of the internal logic of the Declaration of Independence, or even a year before that, if you look at the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, the very last reason why Americans should take up arms, the document ends by saying, and now we have fresh news from the Canadian frontier that Canadian Governor Guy Carleton and his minions are trying to get Indians to come kill you. And that notion is the very last grievance in the Declaration of Independence, that he has excited domestic insurrections and the merciless Indian savages to come and kill us. And I think that helps define who the we, and we hold these truths to be self-evident. Who are we? It's not just the representatives of the Continental Congress, the we as the American people. What you mean by that is we are not all of the people in the Declaration. The tyrant, King George, his arbitrary ministers, an out-of-control parliament. That's not who we are. We who hold these truths to be self-evident, we want to be separate and independent from that kind of behavior. But we're also separate and independent from slaves, from savages, and from foreign mercenaries, all those people who are trying to help the king end our rebellion. Americans are anti-slave, anti-savage, anti-mercenary. And I think that kind of language is on much safer ground for shoring up the Union, unfortunately. And I think it helps give that initial definition, this very hazy time about what it means to be an American and what does it mean to be an American citizen, which is something they don't know anything really about, is by saying we're not those guys. And here are all the stories that prove why that's right.
Yeah. Would you share one of these stories with us? I mean, how exactly did the Common Cause play into Americans' prejudices and unite them by telling them that, hey, Americans were not Native Americans, African Americans, or mercenaries?
Sure. One of the very last stories of 1775 is there's an Indian conference close to Albany that takes place in November of 1775. And Philip Schuyler is in charge, and he writes back a letter to the Continental Congress sort of summing up the conference. And one of the things he says is these Indians here, who, by the way, haven't done anything, and they've been actually very merciful, but they have been asked to, quote, feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood. And that's the quote. And it's all in caps. And as we know in the Twitter world, that means we're shouting at each other, right? So it's all in caps. And Schuyler gives all this information to the Continental Congress about what's gone on, and this is what's been asked of them. And luckily, they haven't responded to this claim, but the British are certainly making it. Continental Congress responds by ordering printers all throughout the American colonies to publish this account. So they send this letter of Schuyler's by order of the Continental Congress to the printers. They printed up many of these printers, not all of them, but many of them follow this order. It's not a binding order of any kind. There's no penalties if they don't, but most people do. And the idea of feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood becomes sort of the very last of the calendar year, the last thing that people read. There are a couple of responses to that, and it's all over the place. One of them is the Indian superintendent, John Stewart, who has been thrown out of Charleston, South Carolina for whispering to Indians, and he's now living in St. Augustine, Florida in exile, writes a letter right around that same time, and he says massacres and instigated insurrections were in the mouths of every child. This is one of the reasons why he's now in exile, is because everybody's talking about this thing. Well, I don't think that those words are in the mouths of those children by accident. They're in some ways by the orders of the Continental Congress. And this is a campaign to make sure the American people know that this is who we're up against. Now, that story then falls out. 2 years later, an aspiring playwright and writer, Hugh Henry Brackenridge, writes a play called The Death of General Montgomery about the American invasion of Canada and the sort of tragic death of General Montgomery. And he talks about how Indians play an important role in that defeat. And he explicitly references the Schuyler letter, feasting on a Bostonian, drink his blood. And this is why I'm sort of portraying Indians and British working in this kind of bloodthirsty and horrible way in this play. So it's become sort of culturally another sort of layer of this thing. And then the year after that, Ben Franklin is now in Paris, and Congress has asked him to put together a children's school book full of atrocities that the British have created. And Franklin, who is an atrocity collector and broadcaster, is the perfect man for this job. So Congress has asked him and given a little bit of seed money for Franklin, and Franklin then drafts Lafayette to help him do this. And they are going to draft about 24 or so engravings done by a Parisian engraver to render scenes of this American atrocity. So Franklin and Lafayette get to work making what they refer to each other as this little book of British atrocities. And these 20-something engravings are going to feature the British setting fire to Falmouth, Maine, and cannonading of Norfolk and all those kind of things. But the last several of these pictures that children are going to hopefully read in the 1780s and 90s and on, what they will remember about the Revolutionary War is about British inciting Indians and slave insurrections. And here again, one of those engravings that Franklin instructs the engraver brings back the feast on a Bostonian and drink his blood image again. And Franklin intended those pictures to adorn the first American coinage. The book sort of evaporates, the trail ends, they lose track of it. We don't know what happens to it at all, unfortunately. But the Feast on a Bostonian is not just some sort of event that happens. It becomes repeatedly sort of reinforced and part of American culture during the Revolutionary era.
Now, despite how they were portrayed in the press, many African Americans and Native Americans served alongside patriots in the fight for independence. Rob, would you tell us about the service of African Americans and Native Americans on behalf of the Patriots, and how all of these common cause stories must have impacted their wartime experiences?
The Continental Army is a very integrated army. Now, Indians serve together as auxiliaries, and they aren't nearly as integrated into the ranks as African Americans will be. But as conscription falls, as the war drags on, and as more and more states draft conscription laws, but then also make provisions for the purchase of substitutes, African American ranks grow and grow into the late 1770s and 1780s. We think somewhere along the lines of 10% of the Continental Army is African Americans, and there's no segregation. Now, Washington, at the beginning of the war, is uncomfortable with this. Washington, when he first gets command of the Continental Army, gives instruction to his recruiters to try to keep free blacks, especially out of the ranks. Don't recruit them. Don't re-enlist them. If they're already here, we'd like for them to leave. There's a big episode of sort of a confrontation between a number of free black veterans who serve very bravely. We have sort of the exceptional stories of Salem Poor and Peter Salem, two African Americans who fight bravely at Bunker Hill. And Washington, by the end of the year, would kind of like for them to leave. And I think Dunmore's proclamation makes him reconsider, because a number of black veterans go to Washington and say, look, if you don't re-enlist us, we're going to go over there to the other side. And that, in the context of Dunmore, makes him rethink things. But you have African Americans serving in very, very important ways. The revolution could have ended in the end of August 1776 very easily if Washington can't get his forces off of Long Island after the debacle of the Battle of Long Island. And historians of yore would have said that fog saves the revolution because it gets foggy that night, and Washington's able to get on boats that takes him across to Manhattan and saves the revolution and keeps Washington from getting captured. Well, yes, fog helps, but there is a unit of soldiers that are really sailors from Marblehead, Mass., led by Colonel John Glover, who are the ones who are ferrying the Continental Army off. And by all accounts, those Marblehead sailors is a very, very diverse group of black sailors and white sailors who saved Washington and the Revolution. And those are also the same guys that are going to come back and be the ferrymen across the Delaware for the Trenton surprise raid. So African-American participation in the Revolution is much more than we have given it credit for. And Judith Van Buskirk has just very recently brought out a book about this, and she goes into a lot of meticulous detail about African-American veterans and participation. What I look at in the common cause is how that participation is silent in the press. What I focus on in the book is stories told, but also stories not told. And in many ways, if you didn't serve in the Continental Army, or watch it march by, if you were just paying attention to the revolution from a distance, either through letters or by reading about it, or you weren't directly involved in the actual fighting, you had no idea that the Continental Army was as diverse as it actually was, that the news of blacks fighting in the revolution was silent. It was almost negligible to find. The same with natives. Now, you do have a couple of times where stories about so-called good Indians fighting with the Americans crop up. But when you compare those drips to the ocean of ink about Indians fighting with the British, it registers almost not at all. So the fact that the American printers and the patriot political and communications leaders don't publicize or point out this service, I think leads to this construction that this is a white man's army and that all natives fought for the king. And in 1855, William Nell brought out a book called Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, and it was kind of a surprise because people didn't think that there were any colored patriots in the American Revolution, that all those embattled farmers were white guys. And I think that narrative begins at the moment.
So just how effective was the Common Cause story in its ability to unite Americans together behind their prejudices and keep them in the fight for independence?
Well, this is a difficult one to prove. I mean, there are important institutions here that are also acting like glue, right? The Continental Congress and the Continental Army They are institutions that kind of are acting like cement for the Union. And when I was listening to your great 4th of July podcast, and Peter Onuf made the point that just by the projection of the name Continental Congress or Continental Army, that they are aspiring to, and in many ways claiming, that we speak for the entire continent, and then we are all one, and we are all in it together. And just the naming practice of that was really important. I think that the chances of disunity, given what we know about American history from 1776 through 1861 and how many times somebody somewhere is talking about leaving the Union or threatening to, I think that the chances of disunity are incredibly high without these kinds of claims about these are the reasons you need to stick with us. And I also think that they don't convince everybody. There are a lot of disaffected people, and there are a lot of loyalist people, but they have to hold on to a certain segment of the population. And one of the ways I think that they did so, and certainly they thought that this was effective because of all the time and money they spent in making this argument and putting it out there, is they thought that fear and outrage were going to play an incredible role, an important role in how Americans thought about the revolution. So you have something like the Carlisle Commission, right? The Carlisle commissioners come over in 1778. This is a peace commission that is sent over by the king that has an incredible offer for the Americans. The Americans have defeated Burgoyne at Saratoga. They're negotiating with France. The Carlisle commissioners sort of be put together and sent over to America before the French alliance is over. But what they're going to offer the Americans is everything they're ever asking for except independence. You can keep the Continental Congress. You can keep the Continental Army. You can make taxes for yourself. We will rescind every imperial regulation since 1763. We're not going to hang anybody. Bygones be bygones. As long as you stay in the empire, you can run your own stuff. It's an incredible offer, and it goes nowhere. When the Carlisle commissioners come, the British Army has occupied Philadelphia, and so the Continental Congress is now in York, in central PA, and they're trying to negotiate if they should even meet with the Carlisle commissioners. And the Continental Congress freaks out. They start sending off proclamations, wild proclamations accusing the British of all kinds of things. Richard Henry Lee and Gouverneur Morris write these big proclamations that bring up all of the accusations of insurrections and massacres again, because they're afraid that this deal might be taken by somebody. South Carolina, New York, Virginia. What happens if the Virginians say we're leaving the Union? Or we're going to take this deal and end this war, which is becoming more and more unpopular. So they're terrified that these kinds of things might happen. And because I think they really could have. So you have to take into account the contingency of union and the fragility of union when we think about how they thought these arguments were winning arguments and how this might hold things together in this kind of rickety union that's always been the case until Reconstruction.
You know, these days it seems like scholars are finding a lot of information, thanks mostly to the Georgian Papers program, that proves that the British were really astute and that they knew exactly what was going on in America during the Revolution. So it seems likely that the British must have known about the Common Cause story and its effects. So, Rob, did you find any evidence of the British making any attempts to stymie the publication and spread of the Common Cause story? Or perhaps any attempts on the part of the British to create their own Common Cause-like story, to encourage imperial unity?
That's a great question. I think because of how we know the story is going to turn out, that no one has really thought it important to figure out if there is such a thing as a British common cause. There is one. I have to give a plug to my very good friend, Brad Jones, who's teaching out at Fresno, who is writing what's going to be a really important book about this, about the formation of a British common cause in Halifax and Jamaica and New York and Scotland, how they figure out how they think about themselves with this American sort of challenge to their Britishness. Now, I do think that the British underestimate the seriousness and the depth of the American resistance movement until the First Continental Congress. If you look at when loyalists begin to really take up their pens and write very effectively and make really good and pointed and penetrating arguments, it's almost all clustered between October, November of 1774 and the spring of 1775. This is when the Charles Inglis's and Thomas Chandler's and the Samuel Seabury's are making all of their points. Up to that point, I think a lot of these loyalists had not felt it really worth their engagement. And that, I think, is a big mistake. Had loyalists really fought on these kinds of terms, if they had realized what was going on with sort of communications networks, if they had done the same kind of work that Sam Adams is doing, the revolution looks very different. But by that point, they're reacting to the First Continental Congress and then the Continental Association. And by that time, it's almost a situation of too little, too late. Now, there is one guy who's really smart. His name is Ambrose Searle, and he is the secretary to the British Commander General William Howe. And he comes over in the summer of 1776 with Howe's invading force. And Searle gets it. Immediately, as soon as Manhattan is cleared of American troops, Searle first publishes under Hugh Gaines' New York Gazette and really establishes the first sort of wartime loyalist paper. Hugh Gaines sees that the British forces are probably going to win this thing, and so he has fled New York for a few weeks, but then comes back to the city and takes over that. But Searle is feeding him all kinds of loyalist news. In his journal, Searle writes about this is where the Patriots are better than us. It's not on the battlefield. It's in the print battlefield, and we have to do a much better job. And at that point, the British, wherever they go, they bring printing presses with them. By the end of the war, New York will have a composite daily loyalist newspaper. That means a new newspaper comes out every day in New York City by the end of the war that's putting out loyalist news and trying to battle what the Patriots are doing. As the Patriots lose their print monopoly, you see support for the war wane as well. So some smart people in the British forces get it, but with hindsight being 20/20, had they figured that out 2 or 3 years beforehand, the revolution, I think, is in a very different channel.
Now, as we've heard throughout this conversation, the Patriots worked really hard to spread and inculcate the ideas of the common cause into American minds. So, Rob, did the common cause story have any lasting impact on the way that Americans remembered the revolution? And does it have any lingering effects even to this day?
Well, I spend the last chapter of this very long book talking about how these stories are not just thrown out with the next day's newspaper, how stories of things like the Wyoming Massacre and the Cherry Valley Massacre and slaves running to Dunmore and slaves responding to the Phillipsburg Proclamation and contracting smallpox and dying at Yorktown, how the first generation of historians, the Mercy Otis Warrens of the world and David Ramsey and Jedediah Morse, how these people talk about them often in their early histories, how poems and songs and plays will include them as featured scenes. And a lot of people remain convinced that things like all Indians are serving with the king, that narrative, which I think Patriot leaders worked really hard to set as part of the foundation of the Republic, I think will inform how people think about Native peoples all the way through. I mean, Andrew Jackson is convinced in the 18 teens that it's still going on. And William Henry Harrison is still convinced in the 18 teens that this is the same fight that the Revolution began. And Alan Taylor's really great work about the War of 1812 and the Chesapeake, that slave rebellions, the ghost of Dunmore comes back. And so I think this has a lingering effect, and I think that people are still talking about and thinking about these kinds of stories and the messages that are contained in them much longer after the Revolution than we've given credit for before.
Let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if there had been no printing presses? Would the common cause have developed? And if so, how would patriots have spread news about it?
That's a good question. I think if there's no printing presses, I don't think there's an American Revolution, or certainly not the one along the lines that we have. I think there might be a Boston Rebellion or another sort of New England uprising, but even that, I'm not even sure happens the way it happens without the printing press. 100 years before independence, you have a pretty significant rebellion in Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion. There's not a printing press on the continent in 1676. Now, other factors are different as well, as far as settlement patterns and people's upset about things. And there isn't an imperial crisis before there is gunplay between Virginians in 1676. But almost everybody who finds out about Bacon's rebellion, the way they find out about it is usually through the king's men. Either Governor Berkeley is writing home, or he's writing to other governors, or he is setting the story about what the rebellion is about, who the rebels are, how he is the good guy in this story. And Berkeley is especially very hostile to print and education. He doesn't want any of that stuff in Virginia because he doesn't want people getting ideas that aren't his. So he has control of the story. And for the most part, almost everybody else in America looks at the Bacon rebels as bad guys. The Americans in the 1760s and 70s can't get their story out. If they can't take claim of these words of patriot and move away from words like traitor or rebel and discredit those, that's not who we are, then I think it's a very different thing. I think the American public does not have the same level of purchase without that work being done beforehand.
So, Rob, what aspect of race and nation making are you researching now?
One of the things during my research I found was this really intricate funeral procession of this Western Maryland frontiersman who happened to die in Manhattan in October of 1775. And he was given this massive funeral in the city. He'd never even been to New York City before. And so I was trying to figure out who this guy was and what's going on. And really, if George Washington would have died in October 1775 in New York City, he would have had the same size funeral as this. So I was trying to scratch my head and figure out who this guy is. It turns out that he is, a year before, seen as this really horrible Indian killer who's the slayer of women and children on the frontier in this kind of horrific massacre on the Ohio River known as the Yellow Creek Massacre, which leads to a war between Virginia and the Shawnees, ends just before the fighting at Lexington and Concord. And this guy, whose name is Michael Cressup, is accused of this, although he doesn't commit those murders. He's accused of it. And Jefferson thinks that he did it, and Jefferson will write and accuse Cressup of doing this really bad thing in his Notes on the State of Virginia. So I published a little piece of this about kind of the redemption of this guy Cressup and how once the war breaks out, he throws down all of his stuff and picks up a rifle and runs to the Cambridge camp. And this sort of act redeems him from sort of Indian killer and sort of savage himself into this worthy patriot. And so I'm sort of extending that into a small book to look at this Yellow Creek Massacre and Cressup and how the revolution transforms ideas about savagery and empire and how Americans begin to think about the Michael Cressups or the Daniel Boones of the world as not sort of quasi-savage people we wouldn't want to have dinner with, but actually these are the people we want to be now and we need in this country. So I'm going to turn that into a sort of a small book.
And do you have a place on the internet where we can go to find out more information about you and how we can contact you with questions?
Absolutely. You can find information about me on my page at the History Department's page at binghamton.edu. Remember not to put a P in there, Binghamton, no P. Or you can email me at rparkins, Parkins, at binghamton.edu.
Robert Parkinson, thank you so much for taking us through the Common Cause and helping us get a better feel for the ideas that so many historians are talking about right now.
Great. Thanks a lot. It was fun.
The Common Cause was an argument or an appeal made by Patriot leaders as to why colonists all over North America should support the Patriot Rebellion. This appeal had two phases. The first phase took place between 1764 and 1774. As Rob revealed, it appealed to colonists using positive ideas about heroic white men who actively resisted tyranny by defending their rights. But as the American Revolution turned into the Revolutionary War, the Common Cause story changed. Instead of continuing on as a positive story, it became a dark one. It proved too hard for the Patriots to bind Americans together behind the idea that they should actively defend their rights once the Revolution turned to war. Therefore, Patriot leaders needed to find a more powerful story, which is why they turned to stories that preyed on Americans' prejudices. As Rob noted, in 1775, the Americans' Common Cause became a story of us versus them, where the us came to be defined as everyone not listed in the Declaration of Independence. Americans were not King George III, they were not slave insurrectionists, they were not savage Native Americans, and they were certainly not foreign mercenaries hired to enter a fight that was not theirs to begin with. Newspapers helped Patriot leaders spread their story far and wide, and in the end, it seems like many Americans bought the ideas conveyed by these stories. After all, as Rob noted, when the Carlisle Peace Commission came to give the Americans everything they wanted but independence, Americans said no. they'd rather be Americans than Britons, given all the diabolical things that Britons had done to incite people against them. As Rob related, the Common Cause story affected how Americans viewed the American Revolution and War for Independence both during and long after these events. The stories of the Common Cause impacted how Americans viewed Native Americans, African Americans, and anyone who was foreign well into the 19th century, and perhaps, one could even argue, into our present day. Look for more information about Rob, his book, The Common Cause, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/144. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, next week we'll be back with a brand new episode about the international dimensions of the American Revolution.